Hello, everyone. Today we begin our 14th study in the book of Isaiah, and we'll be continuing to look at the woes against Jerusalem. Now, just as a quick reminder of where we are, we've been looking at judgment against Jerusalem, at least beginning in Jerusalem, and slowly working our way out to invaders, and then finally the entire world. And as we go back to woes against Jerusalem, we again work our way back out to judgment against all the nations, and then we also contrast that with the Messianic kingdom. So, with that as our background, let's jump into today's study. So, the last woe that we will be looking at is a woe that is levied against the plunderers of the Lord's city, and specifically, Assyria will be called out. So, the first thing that we want to consider is in what way had Assyria been treacherous? How had they dealt treacherously with Jerusalem? So before we answer that, let's go ahead and open our Bibles to Isaiah chapter 33, and let's begin reading in verse 1. It says, "Woe to you who plunder." Again, notice this is our sixth woe in this book of woes that we've been reading. "Though you have not been plundered, and you who deal treacherously, though they have not dealt treacherously with you. When you cease plundering, you will be plundered. When you make an end of dealing treacherously, they will deal treacherously with you." So how had Assyria dealt treacherously with Jerusalem? Well, think back to just the time of Ahaz. Ahaz, he sinned in doing this, but remember, he did reach out to Assyria for help, and he sent them gifts. And we read about that in 2 Chronicles 28, 16 through 18, and then 20 through 22. And then the account in Kings is found in 2 Kings 16, 7 through 10, and then verse 18. And we're told that they helped him not, and they distressed him. They did attack the people that were attacking him, but they didn't do it in a way that was helpful to him. And the implication is that he was placed under tribute at that time as well, and also would be under threat. So they didn't help Ahaz despite their promise, and despite the fact that he had given them a large sum to buy their help. And then, but we see that duplicated with Hezekiah as well. A little bit different situation, but as they were coming in and invading Judah, Hezekiah sent them, and I believe he sinned in doing this and showing a lack of faith in the Lord, but he sent them a note, or sent them ambassadors saying, "I've sinned, I've done wrong, tell me what I owe and I will pay." And the king of Assyria assessed him a certain amount to pay. And by doing that, he implied that he would hold Hezekiah's wrongdoing as taken care of, and that would make things right. But it didn't make things right. In fact, Assyria, the king, would continue to march through Judah and begin its assault on Jerusalem itself. So there was treachery involved even in that. So what we see about these people is that words and promises mean nothing. This king looked at all other people with complete disdain, despising them. He was a very arrogant man. And he didn't value the promise that he had made to people. And by breaking that, he showed how little he thought of other people. And as he would continue to march through Judah, he would kill lots of people and destroy cities, destroy fields, destroy orchards, and all the people that survived would have fled to Jerusalem. So, as a consequence of this, not only would he ultimately get his comeuppances, as you would say, from the Lord himself in Jerusalem, but we're also going to see that the nations, other nations that he had made promises to Babylon and to the Medes and to the Persians, any other negotiations he had made, he's going to treat those people, or he had treated those people, the exact same way. As the Rabshakeh would say, the kingdom, the gods of Jerusalem and of Judah were no different than any other nation. Assyria did not look at Judah and Jerusalem as anything special. The way they mistreated them, they had mistreated and dealt treacherously with all these other nations. And this would fuel so much of the angst and the hatred against Assyria that would drive these other nations, specifically Babylon, ultimately in rising up and overthrowing Assyria. And of course, then the ultimate sign of treachery against the treacherous is this king, his own two sons, as we read about in Isaiah 37:38. His own two sons would kill him while he worshiped in the temple of his God. So this was truly a man that was despised by all. So just an interesting picture. Some of the commentators will say that there's a possibility that Isaiah actually hurled these threats, these woes, into the teeth of the Assyrians as they stood at the wall, and maybe even Isaiah standing at the wall, hurling this down at the people of Assyria as they would come up against Jerusalem. Of course, there's nothing to support that, but it is an interesting picture to imagine Isaiah actually saying these words directly to the Assyrians. And certainly it's intended for them, but maybe even more so for God's people to realize this is the doom and the woe and the curse that stands against them. So as we go into chapter 33, verses 2 through 6, we're going to read about the plunder of the Lord. And what we want to consider is, how is this plunder going to be of benefit to God's people? How will they take advantage of this plunder? So let's look at verses 2 through 6. It says, O Lord, be gracious to us. We have waited for you. Be their arm every morning, our salvation also in the time of trouble. At the noise of the tumult, the people shall flee. When you lift yourself up, the nations shall be scattered, and your plunder shall be gathered like the gathering of the caterpillar. As the running to and fro of locusts, he shall run upon them. The Lord is exalted, for he dwells on high. He has filled Zion with justice and righteousness. Wisdom and knowledge will be the stability of your times and the strength of your salvation. The fear of the Lord is his treasure. So, principally, as we're looking at this, what are the treasures that these people will be able to take advantage of? Well, the ones that are emphasized are spiritual treasures. We see justice, righteousness, wisdom, and knowledge. And as we know from other scriptures, this is something that begins with the fear of the Lord. So Psalm 111:10 talks about the fear of the Lord being the beginning of knowledge, and those that obey his commandments have understanding. And Proverbs 1:7 reads similarly, except for it talks about the fools and the unwise who will not receive correction and knowledge. But all throughout Isaiah, we've been looking at this idea of waiting on the Lord, trusting on him, waiting for him to defend his people. So chapter 8:16 through 20, 25:9, and 28:16 all extol and encourage people to wait on the Lord and not to seek help from anywhere else. And of course, as we've said before, that represents a tremendous declaration of faith and confidence and trust in waiting on the Lord to take care of them. And these people will benefit and be blessed spiritually. Now, there is also the illusion of physical treasure and some plunder that's associated with that. When he says, like the gathering of the caterpillar, as the running to and fro of the locust, the picture may be as you think about a caterpillar munching its way through a leaf, there's no shortage of things for it to eat. There's plenty for it to eat and gather up, and it's going to eat and gather up as much as it can. And then the idea of it kind of just bouncing from place to place. The idea maybe is there's so much treasure, there's so much plunder that people are just going to be scooping it up and carrying as much as they can, and they'll be just going from place to place, gathering the plunder and treasure that's left behind, and taking their time also in gathering all of that up. And this is a picture I think we see throughout scriptures. Incidentally, a bigger picture in Ecclesiastes 2:26, it talks about the person who is wicked, and God gives him not the enjoyment of the things that he's gathered up, but instead he leaves it behind for the one who will depend on the Lord. And Proverbs 28:8 also talks about those who've gathered up treasure and wealth through oppression, and it will be left behind to those who will pity the poor. And so this is a picture we see throughout the scriptures, that people who gather wealth and treasure through illegitimate means, especially through theft and through oppression and through plundering other people, then sooner or later that's going to be left behind. and it will eventually be a treasure that someone better than them can dispense of, and make good use of. And so, anyway, I think there's a reference here to this physical treasure as well. And incidentally, this is going to be, in and of itself, a reoccurring theme throughout today's study. That we're going to see very general terms that clearly have some specific application to Assyria coming and attacking Jerusalem, and then ultimately being destroyed by God in one night. And then the victory, the plunder, the relief, the joy, and the blessings that come from afterwards, mixed with spiritual blessings, the spiritual attack, and the threat of all of these nations that would stomp out God's people, God ultimately judging them. And as we've talked about before, the ushering in of the Messianic kingdom and the spiritual blessings that are associated with that. So we're going to see those themes being interwoven together. In fact, it'll be very difficult, if not impossible, to separate them as we go through certain sections of the book. So keep your eye out for both of those as we go through the text. So as we look at 33, 7 through 9, and we try to, again, match those events to the siege of Assyria upon Jerusalem, how well does it line up? Well, let's look and see. So chapter 33, 7 through 9 says, "Surely their valiant ones shall cry outside. The ambassadors of peace shall weep bitterly. The highways lie waste. The traveling man ceases. He has broken the covenant. He has despised the cities. He regards no man. The earth mourns and languishes. Lebanon ashamed and shriveled. Sharon is like a wilderness, and Bashan and Carmel shake off their fruits." So as we think about their valiant ones crying outside the city, that reminds us of the Rabshakeh, who would come from Assyria. So this was a position of honor. It wasn't the person's name, it was actually his position. But him coming to Jerusalem and crying aloud these great threats and the propaganda that Assyria was using to try to convince people to cave into fear and to give up without fighting, or at least just rob them of any morale and confidence. And the idea of the ambassadors crying, a different kind of crying, actually weeping for the failure of making peace. So whether this is a picture of the ambassadors of Hezekiah going with the tribute and trying to make peace with the king of Assyria, but then him coming anyway and attacking, or whether this is the picture of Eliakim and Shebna on the wall and hearing the threats of the Rabshakeh and not able to find any way to make for peace, actually being instructed by Hezekiah to remain silent, we see them coming back with their clothes torn. In either case, the people who would want for peace, and it was their job to try to look for it, have completely failed. And actually what we're going to see is, again, the Assyrian, the treacherous dealer, is going to break his promise and bring war upon Jerusalem. And as he makes his way, as we saw in 2 Kings 18:13, he is destroying everything as he goes. And we know from the historical records, even when they attacked Syria, Damascus, they destroyed all of the orchards and all the fruit trees and all the crops in the fields around it, making sure that all those that survived wouldn't even have the means to restart life, to feed themselves. And so we see him potentially, literally, as we think about Lebanon, the great forest and the trees there for resources for building. This could be talking about literal burning and destruction of them. Or Sharon for its great beauty, and then Bashan and Carmel representing the orchards and fruits. We see all the resources producing fields of their land, potentially literally languishing, or it could just be a figurative reference to how everything seems so dark and dismal at this time, and everything was languishing. So we see a very clear depiction of the king of Assyria marching his way into Jerusalem. So, what is it that the Lord promised to do when this imminent threat would finally come upon them? And how would this impact the other nations that are around and that would have heard of this action? So in chapter 33, 10 through 13, it says, Now I will rise, says the Lord. Now I will be exalted. Now I will lift myself up. Notice this, I haven't emphasized this before, but so often Isaiah will mention things in sets of three, whether it's to bring emphasis or clarity or just stress the beauty of the things that he's describing. He often comes with figures of three. And we see three references, again, to emphasize that God is going to act very decisively at this moment. Now, as we say at this moment, keep in mind what we talked about last time. There was a chronological reference last time into it wasn't a woe, but it was a rebuke of the women, and he says that within about a year's time that the fields would languish and that they would go without sustenance at that time. And we've moved past that time. So we're within a year of Assyria actually coming in, and it could be that what we're reading is some of the last encouragement and instruction that Isaiah provided even as the king was marching towards Jerusalem. So again, we're looking forward just a little bit into the future, I believe, into God acting against Assyria in judgment. And what he tells them is that you will conceive chaff, you will bring forth stubble. So they had all these great dreams of these things they were going to produce and create, and it was going to be nothing. It was going to be something that could just be blown away. Your breath as fire shall devour you, and the people shall be like the burnings of lime. So they're going to be utterly destroyed and burned down to just the calcium, just the lime that's left. Like thorns cut up, they shall be burned in the fire. Hear you who are afar off what I have done, and you who are near acknowledge my might. So we see God finally acting as we might think of in the fullness of time. So it reminds us of Galatians 4:4, how Jesus was born under the old law of a woman in the fullness of time. Think about how many years had gone by since Genesis 3, when God first told Eve, first announced to mankind that there would be a man born of a woman who would crush the head of the devil, of the serpent. And so they are an allusion to taking away the devil's power of death, and then I think by implication transitively of sin as well. So many thousands of years had passed. And certainly how many hundreds of years had passed since the time Isaiah was talking to the people of his day. And so God's timetable is often very different than our own. 2 Peter 3:8 tells us that one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. Mathematically, that doesn't work. They don't scale. They're in conflict. What that says is, to God, time has no meaning. Not as we know it. It has no impact on God. So his timetable is very different than our own. And certainly he has more things that he's considering than we could even imagine. And that will continue to be a theme as we go through the prophets, where oftentimes the people reach out to God because they don't think he has acted as quickly as they think he should. And so trust and faith are constant reminders that we see. So once Assyria is destroyed, news will travel very far. We read about in 2 Chronicles 32:22 through 23 how many different nations would come to Hezekiah, bringing him gifts and praising both the Lord and him. And so this would be something that we know would travel very far. And but think about the impact that it would have also on the people in the city, on the people in Jerusalem. It should have made them think about how great and how powerful their God was, and be fully convicted and turn towards him with their full heart and their whole heart if they hadn't been doing that already. And clearly this is what God intended to happen, because he says, hear you who are afar off what I have done, and you who are near acknowledge my might. So this is clearly intended to be an example, a sign of God's tremendous power. And it's something that he intends for everybody to hear about and to know, and to make the appropriate response to, and to repent in reverence and to respect him. So back to the people of the city in Jerusalem, how would it impact them? Well, we can imagine, but Isaiah tells us at least the reaction of some of the people. So in 33:14 through 15, it says, "The sinners in Zion are afraid. Fearfulness has seized the hypocrites." And here we have their words put in their mouth for our benefit. "Who among us shall dwell with the devouring fire? Who among us shall dwell with everlasting burnings? He who walks righteously and speaks uprightly, he who despises the gain of oppressions, who gestures with his hands refusing bribes, who stops his ears from the hearing of bloodshed and shuts his eyes from seeing evil." So we see this great description of the kind of people that God is looking for and what he expects them to be. And this is something these people could have been doing all along. So first of all, God's holiness and his jealousy make him a consuming fire. So the idea of him being a devouring fire and dwelling with everlasting burnings, the idea of how can we dwell with God if he is this way? Throughout the Old Testament scripture, God is depicted this way. First to Abraham in Genesis 15:7 through 18, Abraham has a dream that's described as being horror, and certainly it has bad news about his descendants, but God is shown there and depicted there as a burning oven, or as a smoking oven and a burning torch. So the idea of this consuming fire, you see that even in Abraham's vision as early as Genesis 15. But then Exodus 24:17, 34:14, Deuteronomy 4:23 through 24, and then chapter 6:14 through 15, Joshua 24:19 through 20, all of these passages talk about God being a consuming fire and that his name is jealousy. He is a jealous God, and that he would not tolerate them worshiping any other God. They would have to worship him and him alone, and if they worshiped other gods, they would be consumed, even after he had done such wonderful things for them. And then in Hebrews 12:15 through 19, we're told that we've come to the heavenly Jerusalem, and again come to a heavenly Mount Sinai, if you will. And we're told at the conclusion of that our God is a consuming fire. So even in the New Testament, the idea of God being a consuming fire, being a holy God and a jealous God, that picture is maintained for us even today as Christians. It's something that someone who is worthy of fear. But why would these people be afraid? Why does this happen? And I think part of this can be seen in, or part of the answer to this question can be seen in David's response when he had the when he had the Ark of the Covenant brought on the ox cart, and when Uzzah put up his hand to stabilize it, when the ox stumbled, and then God struck him dead, we're told in 1 Chronicles 13:10 through 12 that David was angry with God and that he didn't know what to do. And this, I think, is a general reaction of just us as human beings. When we don't understand God, and when he acts suddenly in a way that surprises us, and we can't explain what he's doing, we're going to react somewhere in between, maybe including both of anger and fear, and not knowing what to do. And so when these hypocrites and these sinners who clearly did not believe in God, certainly his power, and they see such a tremendous demonstration of power, this is going to be like a bolt of lightning to wake them up, and now they're going to be terrified because they never really understood who God was, and they don't know what he's going to do next, and maybe he's going to come after them. So whether they're asking their question sincerely or insincerely, it's a very simple question, and God gives them a very simple answer. And it's a question that he's been answering all along. He provided the answer back in chapter 1 in 16 through 19. We have very similar wording about the simple things that God expects of us. In Micah 6:3, and then going for verses 6 through 8, we have a similar exchange. In verse 3 seems to indicate that these people are asking this question really as a defense, as an excuse that God has asked something too hard, too complicated, and that nobody could possibly hope to please God. But yet, in many ways, these are very simple virtues that God has asked of us. Psalm 15, 1-5 asks the question, who may dwell in your holy hill? And there again, we have a similar answer that's provided. But we have these 6 different points that are provided for us that point to the spiritual righteousness of these people that will be pleasing to God. So we have walking righteously, that's the entire manner of life, speaks uprightly, so what we say are just and right things, and that despise the gain of oppressions. Think about all of the condemnation that has been provided thus far against people who have acquired wealth by oppressing and mistreating people who were politically weak or not in positions of power, taking their land, taking their wealth when they were unable to resist them. So these people, they don't even want the wealth that comes from that. They see it as defiled. And the idea of someone giving a bribe, whether they're putting it in their hand and then offering to shake hands, hiding the bribe, if this person feels it, they let go and they release the money and let it hit the floor. Or whether it's just visibly putting their hands up and saying, no, I will not accept your gift. They're not even beginning to allow for the appearance of a bribe, much less participating in it anyway. And these people, they don't want to hear bloodshed, and they don't even want to see evil. And of course, when we read that, this is the kind of people that may dwell with God and not be afraid of his burnings, of his punishment and his indignation and his judgment. I can't help but think about the movies, the TV shows, the internet videos that we see on YouTube or wherever it may be. Do they fit with this? Or are they characterized by something that provides us pleasure and bloodshed, and certainly things that may provide pleasure in seeing and participating in evil by just watching it? And so also reminded, of course, of what Jesus said about the man who lusts in his heart in Matthew 5, that he's already committed adultery in his heart. Are we this kind of people, or are we the ones who are committing adultery and committing murder in our hearts based off our enjoyment of things that are evil and watching them and taking them and swallowing them deep into our soul? So for the person who would not participate in those things but would maintain this spiritual character, what blessings can they expect? What can they enjoy after the Lord acts? So continuing verse 16, reading through verse 20, he says, he will dwell on high. Again, we're continuing context. This is the righteous people that may dwell with God. He will dwell on high. His place of defense will be the fortress of rocks. Bread will be given him. His water will be sure. Your eyes will see the king in his beauty. They will see the land that is very far off. Your heart will meditate on terror. Where is the scribe? Where is he who weighs? Where is he who counts the towers? You will not see a fierce people, a people of obscure speech beyond perception, of a stammering tongue that you cannot understand. Look upon Zion, the city of our appointed feast. Your eyes will see Jerusalem, a quiet home, a tabernacle that will not be taken down. Not one of its stakes will ever be removed, nor will any of its cords be broken. Again, this is a passage that I think is very clearly looking forward to some of the blessings of victory and overcoming after God acts against Assyria, and in the peace that the region will enjoy. But I think very clearly some of these things are ultimately fulfilled in the Messianic kingdom. So the person who has these spiritual characteristics, the picture is one of safety. Think back to chapter 2 about God's kingdom and his mountain being elevated above every other kingdom. The heights are associated with safety and defense. And so clearly this person will be very safe. But yet something that's not typically available in such places, he's going to be well provided for with plenty of bread and plenty of water. And this reminds me of the story of Elijah, where God took care of him in the wilderness, and the ravens brought him bread, and he was able to drink water from a brook. And eventually, once that ran out, he had provided a widow that he was able to go and to stay with, and she was able to take care of him. And of course, he took care of her as well. So God will take care of his people. And the next thing is we see that they will see the king and his beauty in the land that is very far off. And there is a picture of great peace. The idea that their heart will meditate on terror, it doesn't mean that they will focus on it, but they will have to work to think back to the way it used to be terrible. And they will have to wonder, where is the scribe, the one who weighs, the one who counts the towers? These would be people that would be associated either with tribute or with the strategy or with the preparing the defenses, making the calculations. And this would occur on both sides of a city wall, both those defending as well as those that are attacking. Anyway, that's not going to happen anymore. That's going to be a different land at different times. These people would have peace. And remember, we talked about earlier when the priest and the prophets were so drunk that they could not talk to the people without stammering. And God said that he would send a people to them that would sound like they were stammering. It would be the Assyrians who would have this terrible speech. And that here we see this being reversed. That these people are no longer going to hear that. In other words, there's no longer going to be an invader coming in with some unknown language they don't recognize, threatening them. And so, again, a complete picture of invasion not being a threat. And instead, they're going to see Jerusalem grow. Now, the idea of it being like a tabernacle or a tent that's not threatened, that's not moved, and that its cores are not cut down, we have somewhat similar language used in Zechariah 2 about God being a wall of fire and the city of Jerusalem not needing physical walls when they returned from Babylon. So there's some similar language that again talks about the safety of these people and the security of them. Of course, it's not to be taken literally. This is a figurative reference because, as you know from the book of Nehemiah, rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem was a very critical objective, something that they needed to do. However, in all of that, whether it was rebuilding the walls or rebuilding the temple, God was with them. He was taking care of them as long as they would lean on him and as long as they would rely on them. So I think this is language that could again refer to the peace and the stability that the people, that Hezekiah and the people would enjoy after Assyria was destroyed. But I think also, obviously, there is some very strong messianic language. And it's really only in the church and then finally in heaven, of course, where the kingdom cannot be destroyed. It cannot be shaken. Even if someone was to come in and to kill all the members of the church, all Christians everywhere, the kingdom would not be in any way diminished. The kingdom would be just as large as it was before. None of these people would cease to exist. And so this is certainly true in God's kingdom. Zechariah 9 through 10, as well as Psalm 72:8, also talk about the Messiah ruling over from sea to sea and including all nations. And in fact, where it says here in chapter 33, where we're reading in Isaiah, that you will see the land that is afar off, it can also be translated that you will see the land that is expansive. It is the land of great distances. So it's not so much, it could be saying that it's not so much that the land is far away. It's just that it is a land that has great distances, that is far away from one end to the other. And so that would be a very clear messianic reference if that's indeed the meaning there. And depending on the translation, you may see that it talks about the land of great extents or great expanses. And that would be the idea. And then lastly, I can't help but think about Moses standing on Mount Nebo, looking over over the land of Canaan, the promised land, and being allowed to see it and being allowed to view it. There could also be in this idea that these people, not that Hezekiah and Isaiah's generation will experience this land, but they will be able to come into a position where they can see it in a figurative way, much like Moses was able to see the promised land without at that very moment going into it himself. So I think these are all different ways that help us understand that, but I think ultimately the best way to understand this is a general principle that has very specific application to Assyria, but it's not limited just to the victory and the blessings that they will enjoy after overcoming Assyria. This is a general principle for God's people and the kind of people that he is looking for and the protection that he will provide. So continuing verses 17 through 24, but there the majestic Lord will be for us a place of broad rivers and streams, in which no galley with oars will sail, nor majestic ships pass by. For the Lord is our judge. The Lord is our lawgiver. The Lord is our king. He will save us. Again, another set of three that Isaiah is using for emphasis. So we see God being the great protector and bringing salvation, and then being able to rely on him. Your tackle is loose. They could not strengthen their mast. They could not spread the sail. Then the prey of great plunder is divided. The lame take the prey, and the inhabitant will not say, I am sick. The people who dwell in it will be forgiven their iniquity. And some parts of this are fairly obvious, and some parts are a little bit difficult to understand, but we can still get the big picture even if we don't understand the exact details. First of all, who are the people that are going to be blessed? They are going to be the ones who recognize God as judge, lawgiver, and king. And this reminds us of Matthew 7:21 through 23, where the people will come before Jesus in the last day and say, Lord, Lord, have we not done all these great things for you? And then he ultimately says, depart from me, I do not know you, who work lawlessness. These are people who did not recognize that there was a law, and they had no intentions of following it. And then James 4:11 through 12 reminds us that there is one lawgiver and judge, and it's not us. And so who are we to behave in that way? So these people that will enjoy this salvation are people who understand that. And in the Messianic kingdom, Christians recognize that Jesus is going to be our judge in the last day. And he's our lawgiver now. John 5:22 talks about God the Father committing all judgment to the Son. And in 1:17, we're told that the law came by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus. And recall, Moses said in, I believe it was Deuteronomy 18, that there would be another prophet like him that God would raise up who would speak to them concerning all things. And then we're told in Acts 3 by Peter that refers to Jesus. So in the same way that Moses was a lawgiver and prophet for God and provided the truth on all things, the law, then the same way Jesus is. He is also provided a new law, and we're supposed to hear him in all things. And it is a law of grace and truth. And then Hebrews 12:24, again, just a reminder that we're coming to heavenly Jerusalem and a heavenly Mount Zion. And then Revelation 17:14 depicts Christ as a King of Kings, or the King of Kings for us. And so just real quickly, what's this idea about the waters and the rivers and the galleys and the boats? How are we supposed to understand those things? Well, we know both from geography as well in history, but also the Bible tells us that some of the cities of that time were situated along major rivers, and they would use these rivers both for water supply, but also as a defense, as a moat, if you will. And then so you can imagine, depending on the size of that, those waterways might be used by attackers to bring in large invading forces very quickly on boats. And the idea is just simply that they're not going to be invaded anymore. As a city, they will not have to be worried about such things. Of course, Jerusalem was in a mountainous area, and there was not a river so large that could carry a galleon, a galley ship, a warship on the waters. But it seems to be just a picture, a figure here. And so it does remind me where he talks about that their tackle is loose, they could not strengthen their mast, they could not spread the sail. To me, that is a picture of the ship completely broken down. And so it reminds me of Pharaoh chasing the Israelites through the Red Sea. They walked on dry land. He tried to chase them. And as we read about in Exodus 14:22 through 31, that as they chased, the wheels fell off. And then finally they knew they were in trouble. And then God brought the waters upon them, and they were unable to escape from this. And so there would be a tremendous destruction that would come upon the Assyrians. And the idea of the inhabitant not saying, I'm sick, or not being unable to enjoy the plunder, not being able to participate because they were lame. There was going to be so much plunder after the Assyrians are gone that all of these people will be able to enjoy this. It reminds us of the story of the lepers who found all the treasure that was left outside after the Assyrians attacked in 2 Kings 7:1 through 20. And there being just so much more than enough for everybody. And certainly it would have been the same in the case of the attack of the Assyrians. I will mention very quickly that some people see the idea of the ship could be a reference to Jerusalem's present state, that as Isaiah is looking off and seeing the great security and the blessing and the holiness of the Messianic kingdom, or of just how Jerusalem will be better. They will be more reverent and more trusting and faithful after God acts in this way. So as Isaiah is looking to the future, but he's comparing it to the state of Jerusalem at that very moment, they're not in a good state. I do not lean that way just simply because it seems like it's taking it too far out of the context. The picture of the ship already introduced is that of an oppressive and attacking and invading force. So it seems strange to change the imagery so quickly. So I believe the picture is of that invading force breaking down and being able to complete their designs in their mission to destroy Jerusalem. But again, some application to the immediate time, but clearly there's a very spiritual and ultimately, I think, a messianic fulfillment of all of these things. We see again the people who dwell in the city will be one that their iniquity has been forgiven. All right, so with that, we move into the last section of this little section, where we're going to focus on a destruction against, again, the entire world. And we're going to see Edom that's going to be highlighted versus the Messianic kingdom and how these two are going to be contrasted. So as we go into chapter 34, everything, the tone changes very dramatically. Come near, you nations, to hear, and heed, you people. Let the earth hear and all that is in it, the world and all things that come forth from it. For the indignation of the Lord is against all nations, and his fury against all their armies. He has utterly destroyed them. He has given them over to the slaughter. Also their slain shall be thrown out. Their stench shall rise from their corpses, and the mountains shall be melted with their blood. All the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll, and their host shall fall down as the leaf falls from the vine, and as a fruit falling from a fig tree. So we've seen language like this already in the book, so I won't spend a tremendous amount of time dealing with that. But as we've seen before, this is language that sounds an awful lot like the end of the world. Is it referring to the end of the world? I don't think so, again, for the same reasons that we've discussed before. So I believe what we see is, as we saw in previous sections, we have, again, a declaration of judgment against all the nations of the earth. And this is an expression of general judgment against all the nations of the earth. So, or against the entire world. So think about 1 John 2:15 through 17 and James 4:4, that whoever loves the world or makes themselves a friend of the world makes themselves an enemy of God. The nations of the world in their carnal nature are opposed to God. And certainly, inasmuch any of these nations where they directly turn upon God's people and they try to destroy them, as the Assyrians would do, or the Babylonians would do, or other nations would do, God is going to bring judgment upon them. So, again, I think this is a very general statement. It says it's against all nations, but I think the specific application in their time would be to Assyria. As time would go by, other nations would fall under this same rule. Babylon, Greece, the Medes and Persians, and then the Romans as well. This would be something that would apply over and over again. Now, another reason we know that this is not the end of the world, this is something that's happening over and over again steadily through time, is because once a nation is destroyed, we don't read about nations being resurrected or being brought back. The only thing that even comes close to that is the nation of Judah in Ezekiel 37. But they're not completely destroyed. They are people that have been carried off to Babylon. And the idea is that God can resurrect those people into the nation of Israel again, back in their homeland. But still, they weren't completely destroyed. What we see is that throughout the scriptures, even though we see nations symbolized as a person or as a lady or as their ancestor, however they may be figured, when they are destroyed, they don't come back. There's no coming back. So it doesn't make sense to think of all of these at the end of time being judged. They're being judged as their time comes to an end throughout time over the course of history. And so I think that's another clue that we're not talking about the ultimate destruction against the entire world, but rather against all of the nations as they turn against God and as their end comes within their time. So continuing in 34, he says, "For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Indeed, it shall come down on Edom and on the people of my curse." So we're continuing to talk about this destruction, but now it's been pinpointed on Edom. "The people of my curse for judgment. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood. It is made overflowing with fatness, with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For the Lord has a sacrifice in Bozrah, and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. The wild oxen shall come down with them, and the young bulls with the mighty bulls. Their land shall be soaked with blood, and their dust saturated with fatness. For it is the day of the Lord's vengeance, the year of recompense for the cause of Zion." So we have the picture of God's sword bathed in heaven. The idea is that it is drunk so much injustice and that it cannot take anymore, and that it's going to come down from heaven, and it's coming down upon the people of Edom, and they're specified as the curse. And we have this picture of this destruction as a sacrifice, that there's going to be the great shedding of blood. And the idea of these different kinds of animals, from some of them more valuable and some of them more plain, this could be a depiction of all of the different kinds of people in Edom that would be destroyed, from the noble people to the poor and the common people. Nobody would escape. This would be something that would come upon all of them. Bozrah being a city within Edom that could mean either sheepfold or fortress. In either case, it would have significance, since we're talking about the destruction of all the lambs and the sheep, or the fortresses coming down and nothing being a place of stronghold. But please notice that this is the day of the Lord's vengeance, the year of recompense for the cause of Zion. This is not an arbitrary destruction. This is a judgment. This is a punishment. So the wrongdoing that brought this judgment upon them long preceded and precipitated this judgment and this destruction. So in Deuteronomy 23:7, the Israelites were told not to despise the Egyptians because they had been in their land and they had been a traveler, a pilgrim in their land, and not to despise the Edomites because they were their brother. So if you go all the way back to the time of Jacob and Esau, they were both brothers, sons of Isaac. And so the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, were cousins. They were very close relatives nationally of the Israelites. And of course, many generations had passed, but they should have been a close people. And God expected them to have some level of respect and concern from each other. And the Israelites were not allowed to take the land of the Edomites because God had given that to them. They had distinct heritages from each other. And as we'll see, that's one of the condemnations of the Edomites. They weren't satisfied with that. So as we look through the book of Obadiah, short book, it's only one chapter, and then Joel 3:19 mentions this, Amos 1:10 through 15, and then even as we come to the time of Ahaz in 2 Chronicles 28:17, we see that over and over again the Edomites were attacking the Israelites, especially the people of Judah, killing the innocents, accepting whole cities being taken away as slaves. And then as Jerusalem's being attacked, they're essentially standing on the side, cheering on the attackers, is the picture, saying, raise it, burn it to the ground. They had a clear hatred for God's people, and they were a very proud people, and there was no mercy, or there was no compassion for God's people in this. They took advantage of every opportunity to destroy them. Psalm 83 as well as 137 will tell us of confederations that they participated in with the surrounding nations to bring Jerusalem, to bring God's people down. And so these were people that were always looking to destroy God's people. They had killed so many of them innocently and with great hatred. And so it is that wickedness that's being avenged, that's being being paid for. There's a reckoning of. So what we see is that Edom has a history of being profane, rejecting God, rejecting his people, going all the way back to Esau. So think back to Genesis 25:29 through 34, when Esau was so willing to give up his birthright. This would have included the spiritual blessings as a descendant of Isaac, and he was glad to give those up for a pot of stew. Admittedly, he was very hungry, and he said he thought he was going to die, but there are some things that are more valuable than life itself, and he was glad to give this up just for a pot of stew. And then in 26, 34 through 35, we see that he again recognizes no special distinctness of his heritage and who he is. And whereas Abraham and Isaac, especially as they came to Jacob, were very careful to make sure that they had good wives selected for their sons, he selected wives from the Canaanites, specifically from the Hittite nation, and he saw no distinction in himself. And then in Numbers 20:14 through 21, we see the Edomites much more mature now as a people, and they won't even let the Israelites pass through their land. In fact, they're willing to come out and attack them to prevent them from passing through their land. So there is this great disdain for spiritual things, for holy things. That is something that is true of this people, going all the way back to their ancestor. And Hebrews 12:15 through 17 has a warning against being like Edom, who was a profane person and did not value spiritual things. So putting all of this together, if we assume that Edom is a sign, a figure, what is it that they represent? Well, it seems that they represent a nation, a people that is entirely profane, that a unholy, a not spiritual people that are not only not spiritual, they're actually despise God, they despise his people, and they're willing even to go out and to attack them and to destroy them at every opportunity they have. And so Edom seems to stand as this symbol. Now, that certainly includes the literal Edom as well. We have a bigger picture that's painted for us, but included in that picture is the kingdom of Edom, because they are what they eventually would stand to represent. So Jeremiah 25:49, Ezekiel 25 and 35, we read about the destruction of Edom in the invasion that would be brought down by the Babylonians. And so this would literally happen to the Edomites, as well as figuratively happen to all the nations that would be like them. All right, so as we continue in chapter 34, after this destruction has passed, what would the land be like? And again, do we interpret this figuratively, literally? How are we supposed to understand it? If it's figurative, what does it represent? So reading in 34:9-14, we're told, speaking of the land of Edom, its streams shall be turned into pitch, and its dust into brimstone. Its land shall become burning pitch. It shall not be quenched night or day. Its smoke shall ascend forever. From generation to generation it shall lie waste. No one shall pass through it forever and ever. But the pelican and the porcupine shall possess it, and the owl and the raven shall dwell in it. And he shall stretch out over it the line of confusion and the stones of emptiness. They shall call its nobles to the kingdom, but none shall be there, and all its princes shall be nothing. And thorns shall come up in its palaces, nettles and brambles in its fortresses. It shall be a habitation of jackals, and a courtyard for ostriches. The wild beast of the desert shall also meet with the jackals, and the wild goat shall bleat to its companion. Also the night creature shall rest there, and find for herself a place of rest. There the arrow snake shall make her nest and lay eggs and hatch and gather them under her shadow. There also shall the hawk be gathered, every one with her mate. Not one shall lack her mate, for my mouth has commanded it, and his spirit has gathered them. He has cast a lot for them, and his hand has divided it among them with a measuring line. They shall possess it forever. From generation to generation they shall dwell in it. So we have a picture of this great kingdom, its palaces, its governments, and where once all these regal and noble people once sat and made tremendous decisions, now it's filled with animals. And it's almost mocking how they are now the government and bleeding to each other, and they're meeting and convening. And this picture of tremendous destruction and everything being laid waste, the land burning, again depicting the destruction of it and the uselessness of it, and it being something that's completely taken over by wild animals, and it being something that would continue to stand forever, because this is what God has declared. So again, are we supposed to take this literally? Well, I think there again is a very strong figurative reference, that we're supposed to understand that Edom represents something, this profane nation, and is its character, and as its adversarial nature against God and his people have already been depicted before us. Now we see the destruction of this type being shown before us, and it's going to be completely destroyed. And this is something that will generally happen to, again, I think is the point of this, that every nation that exalts itself against God, especially the nations that go in turn against God's people and go to attack them and to destroy them, and they bring doom upon themselves. And as we look at Ezekiel 35:14-15, and then 36:5-7, we see there again Edom being associated with the nations and seeming again to represent a type of all of the nations, any kind of nation that would so exalt itself. Now, interestingly, as far as we know, the land of Edom literally is like that to the day. It's not inhabited, and it's not a land that's good for anything. Now, it's not literally on fire, but it is destroyed. It is desert land, and it's something that's just occupied by wild creatures. And we have so many of them that have been described for us. Incidentally, translations vary on this. Animals can be a hard thing to translate, and so you may have different translations on the exact nature of the animals. But it's interesting, again, the comparison and the contrast. what is Edom's city going to be like versus Jerusalem versus Zion? Well, Edom is going to have a line, going to have the plummet stretched across it. They're going to be looking to compare it, and the line's going to be confusion, emptiness, destruction. That is the standard of the city. In other words, they're going to keep working at it until the city is destroyed. But what is the line in the plummet of Zion, of Jerusalem? Well, we read in 28:17 that it's justice, it's righteousness. So we have two very different cities, two very different nations, if you will. And even though it may not be the original or the intended point of the text, inasmuch as these represent God's people, and any nation that would exalt itself against God and the destruction that would come upon it and the emptiness of it, we could also say the same. We don't do any injustice to the truth to say it's also true of the individual spiritually, that inasmuch as the spiritual person who waits on God will have these blessings of wisdom and justice and righteousness, and they will have the character that we've been reading about, and they'll have the fullness of that, and they'll have the joy that will come from that. In the same way, the person who exalts themselves against God, turns against God, is a profane person, and even goes so far to attack God's people, then and be adversarial against God and against him, that this is the emptiness, this is the desolation, and this is the destruction that they can expect upon themselves spiritually, the ruin of their own soul. So very powerful pictures that are being shown before us. So what about the idea of the fire burning forever? We see a similar reference in usage of Sodom and Gomorrah in Jude 7, where we're told that they're suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. And I believe the idea is that we, every time we open the Bible, from here to the end of time, when we go and we read about Sodom and Gomorrah, what do we see about them? We see them suffering fire. We see this destruction upon them. This is all that we know of them. And in the same way, this is all we know of Edom. There is no other fate. So it may not necessarily be a reference to eternal judgment, but the fact that this is all that we know of them from Scripture, as much as we read about, in a similar way, about Melchizedek and in his unusual nature as well. So, question number 29, how are the Jews, and by extension us, how are we expected to make use of these prophecies? Since this is something that was still a little ways off, how are they supposed to make use of it? Well, obviously there was supposed to be some message of encouragement, strength to hang on, to trust in God and to have faith in God. But there was an interesting thing that he said in verse 16. He says, this was the part that I omitted in the last question, search from the book of the Lord and read, not one of these shall fail. Not one shall lack her mate, for my mouth has commanded it, and his spirit has gathered them. So one of the things that we often see throughout Scripture is the idea that God willingly, freely puts himself and his prophets to the test. Do the things that they foretell, do the things that they say, do they come true? And if we think about prophecies that have already been made in Isaiah that are already fulfilled by this point, like the destruction of the kings of Syria and the king of Samaria, of the northern kingdom, that they would be destroyed in short order and that Ahaz would not have to worry about them. And that's something that we've already seen by this point in time, if we're Hezekiah and his people. And other prophecies that have been made up to this point, some of them have already been fulfilled. And so that would have brought encouragement as well, to see that and to know that if God could keep his promises and fulfill these prophecies, then he's going to keep these other promises and fulfill these new prophecies. So as we often see in Bible books, we will see like a verse that stands out kind of on its own and almost serves to introduce a major theme that will become very important later. And this we have in this case. This will become a major theme in the second half, if you will, of the book, even though they're not equal halves in size. So this is going to be a very prominent point. All right, so lastly, we have a very short chapter that goes with the one that we were just reading. Chapter 35 says there is an encouragement to be strong and not to fear, and this is provided to those who are admittedly weak, feeble, and fearful. Why were these people to take courage? How could such a people take courage? Who were these people? So as we read, it explains, the wilderness and the wasteland shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice, even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the excellence of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord, the excellency of our God. So we have a role reversal, as we've seen so many times before. Something that is described as being poor, as being barren, as being unfruitful, now will be blessed with great beauty and great strength and great fruitfulness. And so the reference to Lebanon, the strength and the glory of the cedar, and then Carmel and Sharon would be the glory of their fruits and their flower. So we have a beautiful picture that's being applied to something that did not have such beauty previously. And it's clearly we're talking about people, because we're told they shall see the glory of the Lord, the excellency of our God. So, based on this, strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who are fearful-hearted, be strong and do not fear. Behold, your God will come with vengeance. With the recompense of God, he will come and save you. So this, again, with this reference to vengeance, this helps us to understand why these people were so oppressed and they were in such terrible straits. It's because they were being so mistreated by somebody else unjustly, and God's about to act in their behalf, and he will revenge and he will recompense. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the dumb sing. For water shall burst forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The parched ground shall become a pool, and the thirsty lands springs of water. In the habitation of jackals, where each lay, there shall be grass with reeds and rushes. So again, we have this strong reversal. And what is the encouragement? That God is going to do this. And because he will be both just, that he will take vengeance and recompense upon his people mistreated, and then because he will also be merciful and provide salvation to his people. That should be something that inspires courage and inspires confidence to know that he's going to do this. That, again, as we've seen, that he has been doing this, and that he's going to do this in a significant way very soon, should have been something that would have been very motivating to them. So it just reminds us of Hebrews 13:5, where he says that he would never leave us or forsake us. And then Philippians 4:5, where we're reminded that God is near, he is at hand. And then in 2 Thessalonians 1:6-8, we're reminded in the last day that God will, even then, if it hasn't been taken care of by that point, that he will come in vengeance upon those that trouble God's people. And that will be the response of the last day. Again, as we've seen in other passages, certainly there is a fulfillment in, I think, what would have been a spiritual reformation, a resurgence post the destruction of Assyria. However, this is obviously something that would not persist, because we know Manasseh would follow Hezekiah and take the kingdom into deep darkness. So, but there would be a resurgence at that time. Ultimately, again, this points to the Messianic era, to the Christian age, to the church. Think about Jesus in Matthew 11:1-6. And I've gone blank. Oh, yes, I remember. When John would send his disciples and say, are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah? Or should we search for another? And after performing some miracles, he tells them to go back to John, in essence, and say that you've seen the eyes of the blind opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. And it seems that he's quoting and making use of this passage from Isaiah and applying it to himself, both very literally and miraculously as he's performing these things. But clearly there's also a spiritual connotation in which people's minds and understanding would be opened, and that they would be able to understand God and see God through the gospel. And Jesus points to that as well in Matthew 11, that the gospel is preached. So, question number 31, does the way of the ransomed represent a physical or a spiritual path? How does this help our understanding of the preceding contrast against Edom? So as we continue to struggle with these references that are very grandiose, very great and dramatic references, how do we understand those? So reading in verses 8 through 10 of 35, we're told, a highway shall be there and a road, and it shall be called the highway of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it, but it shall be for others. Whoever walks the road, although a fool, shall not go astray. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast go upon it. It shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. And the ransom of the Lord shall return, and come to Zion with singing, with everlasting joy on their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. So as we read about this highway of holiness, I think again we have a figurative reference to the spiritual joy, the spiritual salvation, the spiritual blessings that the God's people will enjoy in the Messianic kingdom. And so this is the path back to God, if you will, the path that God's people will walk as they return to God and ultimately as they come home to heaven. Notice a few things about this path. First of all, there's something about the path that it prohibits the unholy, the unclean. They're not going to be found there. And there is going to be an ease to it, as well as the joy that's associated with it and the sure victory that's associated with it, such that it's something that anybody can succeed in. And so we're reminded of Matthew 11, 28 through 29, where Jesus says to come unto him, ye that are burdened and heavy laden. And he describes himself as being meek and lowly in heart. And he says that his yoke is easy and light. And we have that, which fits very well with what we're reading. But then how do we reconcile it with passages like Matthew 7, 13 through 14, where Jesus talks about the way being difficult and narrow, and few there are that find it. And I think the understanding is comparatively, it is easy. The way of sin is so much harder. It may be easier at first, but even in this life, it becomes increasingly harder to continue to go against God and to live a life that's contrary to his commands and his laws, which we're told are for our good always. We accrue more and more spiritual debt, and we suffer under a heavier and heavier load. As we've seen of Isaiah already, the people that were pulling their great burdens of sin with cords of vanity and nothingness. So I believe the point is that relatively speaking, this is something that would be easier, and the point is it's accessible. And I think that's the same point that's made in Romans 10, 5 through 11, is that God's word is not so far off that we have to go up into the heights of heaven or the depths of hell to retrieve it. It's something that's made accessible to us, where we can use it and we can be saved, and we can enjoy all of the blessings of it and be secure in that. I believe it's the same picture that's being painted here as well. So just as we think about that, how are these people described? They're described as people that are coming with joy, coming with singing. Is that the way we feel? Do we feel like a people that are overjoyed? Do we feel the desolation of sin? Do we realize where we were? Do we understand the heartache that is associated with that life? And do we appreciate all the joys and the blessings that we have now as Christians? Are our lives and our hearts, figuratively, if you will, filled with joy and singing? Not to mention literally as we come together and worship God and sing together. But is this something that describes our very demeanor and our attitude? Or are we people that still don't quite understand the path that we're on, and maybe don't belong on that path? Well, this concludes what I think is probably one of the more difficult sections of the book, just because of all of the great figures that are there. And even though there are details, it's hard to tell exactly where the application belongs. I think the general principles there are very clear, in that there was an imminent destruction that was coming upon the land, or an imminent threat, I should say, from the king of Assyria, the literal physical king of Assyria. And it was going to be a great time of testing for God's people, and a great time of suffering. However, God was going to judge the nation of Assyria, and then that would follow with some joy and relief and victory and peace and quiet. In a much greater way, there is a much bigger threat, in that we have all the nations of the world, if you will, that are at one time or another are opposed to God. And once we see that there is a judgment, not just against Assyria, but against all the nations, that as they exalt themselves and they contend with God and they try to destroy his people, then they too will also be judged, and they too also will be brought down. And then we have Edom taken as both a literal kingdom, but also as a representative of all these nations that despise God's people and mistreat them and are proud and elevate themselves above God. They will be brought down, and they will be destroyed. And then contrast with that, we have the establishment of the Messianic kingdom, which will not be destroyed, which will consume the entire earth. And these people will spiritually enjoy tremendous blessings and protection and security in God. Now, physically, they may continue to suffer, but they will have these spiritual blessings that cannot be taken away. Next time, we will look at the capstone, the physical fulfillment, the actual history that will satisfy the prophecies that we've been reading and studying about thus far. I hope this study has been very helpful for you. I hope you are looking forward to reading and understanding about the fulfillment of these prophecies as they worked out during the life of Isaiah and Hezekiah. I'm looking forward to reading and studying these as well. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention. And my prayers will continue to be for you and for all of God's people and students of His Word. Thank you, and have a good day.